Good morning, and welcome to another episode of Coffee and Tea with AARP, a bi-weekly program in which AARP staff and sometimes volunteers, but not today, speak with Connecticut decision makers about the issues that impact older adults. Today, we are thrilled to be joined by Sean Ghio, who is the policy director at the Partnership for Strong Communities. He's been there since 2017, and at the partnership, he leads their statewide advocacy efforts on affordable housing and manages the Home Connecticut campaign, which aims to increase the stock of affordable housing in Connecticut. In addition to all of that, he's also responsible for overseeing the partnership's research, analysis, and housing policy recommendations. So, Sean, I know you're busy, and we appreciate that you're here with us today. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
Great. And I should mention, I'm Anna Doroghazi. I'm one of the policy directors at AARP Connecticut, and we're really excited to talk about this topic of housing and affordable housing because it's an issue that impacts every Connecticut resident, and it impacts older adults, but also people of all ages. And it's a huge topic. People have a lot of big feelings about it. So let's just jump right in. So Sean, let's cover to start just a few affordable housing basics. When we say affordable housing, what does that mean? What exactly is affordable housing?
Yeah, it can be confusing for folks. And I think what people, non-policymakers, folks not involved in the state legislature or work like that, it really just means that affordable housing, homes that we can afford. So traditionally, Connecticut, like other places, has built a lot of homes that a wide range of folks could afford. And generally, the federal government, when it talks about what's affordable for a family, we're talking about spending less than 30% of their income on housing costs. And so, I live in a home that I can afford, and maybe you do as well. So that's sort of the general term of affordable. But when we're talking about policy, we're talking about what I like to call uppercase or capital A affordable. And what that means is homes that are guaranteed to remain affordable to certain folks at certain income levels. So again, that 30% benchmark for spending no more than that on housing is often the benchmark for capital A affordable housing too. So people may be familiar with public housing or housing vouchers, federal program, people know Section 8. Those are capital A affordable housing programs that guarantee that the tenant or homeowner in that type of housing doesn't spend more than about 30% of their income on housing.
Wow. So even just in answering that one question,
yeah, I know.
It's a lot of information.
Yeah.
So I guess, just in terms of follow-up questions, the first thing that comes to mind as you're describing that is that affordable, it's a bit of a moving target. So what's affordable, to you and I with, similar kind of white collar jobs is a different kind of affordability than someone who's making minimum wage, and a different affordability than someone who, is maybe more, more well off. So that's interesting, and it must be hard to,
yes,
get everyone on the same page in terms of what we're talking about.
Yeah, the question is always affordable to whom, right? That is a question. And my neighborhood is affordable to people that earn the money comparable to what I earned, but there's very little housing choice in this neighborhood for folks that may earn less, right? They wouldn't be able to afford to live in my neighborhood.
Yeah. So I think a few other terms that I hear a lot during policy conversations about housing are, in addition to affordable, assisted and supportive housing. How are assisted housing and supportive housing different than affordable housing?
Yeah, we're going to get real into the weeds fast. So, assisted particularly is a hard term because it means something in normal life, right? Outside of housing policy, assisted living, for instance, folks, I think that's more generally understood, but assisted living, how that type of living arrangement is. But for the state, it's another way of talking about affordable housing, and we say assisted. So sometimes they're used interchangeably. And that capital A housing, and so that can get confusing. Now, supportive housing is essentially affordable housing with supportive services that the residents might need. So depending on the residents' needs, whether that's folks with intellectual disabilities, folks with physical disabilities, that sort of supportive wraparound services, you'll hear that term too. These are providing the level of care in the home to maintain, so the person can maintain a stable home. And it's often associated with folks that that may be sort of on that edge of becoming, another term, housing insecure, right? Folks that, but for the availability of support, they may not be able to keep their home. They may fall into becoming homeless. So that's what supportive housing is. It's often, so I would call it a part of that affordable housing spectrum.
Okay, so let's go back to that bigger spectrum of affordable housing in general. Do we have enough affordable housing in Connecticut? And if not, why not? And how great is the need for more affordable housing?
Right. So again, talking about capital A, the restricted housing, stuff that is guaranteed in some form to remain affordable to folks at certain income levels. That we do not have enough. But I think if we talk about that sort of lowercase a, just in the state, do we have, are folks able, is the state at large able to afford our homes? And the truth is that over generation or more now, the price of homes, whether buying or renting, has the increases have well outpaced salary and income and wage growth, right? So housing in general is just less and less affordable in the state for all of us. We're all spending generally more of our income just to remain housed. So, and just to give you one example or one data point, I guess, is about 50%, it's a little over that now, of renters in the state spend over that 30% amount. So, it's about 52% now. That's and there's almost 500,000 renter households in the state. So there's quite a lot of people just in the renter side that more than half of them are already spending more than the federal government thinks they should. And that has all kinds of implications in their life in terms of childcare, so being able to afford childcare, being able to afford reliable transportation, being able to find a home where they want and where it's convenient, near family or jobs. Those are all so that is that's sort of one sign, if you will. The renters, we call that cost burden, right? That they're cost burdened by their housing. That there's just not enough affordable lowercase a housing. Now, if that's the case, there's absolutely not enough capital A housing, right? And most of that capital A housing is designated for folks that are in lower or moderate income, that have lower moderate household incomes, that can't compete for home purchases or rent for against like me, right? Like I can outbid folks of lower incomes. And that's why we need that supply of guaranteed affordable housing, right? For lower income folks on fixed incomes, for whether it's Social Security or disability benefits. We need that capital A affordable housing.
Which I think is something that everyone would agree to, at least in principle. I don't think there are a lot of folks out there who would say, I don't want people to be able to afford their housing. But in these policy conversations, certainly, as you know, they get really heated and really divisive, and it's hard to land on solutions that seem to resonate with everyone. So what do you think are some of the barriers to building more affordable and accessible housing? If it is something that we all want, at least theoretically. What gets in the way of making this a reality?
Yeah, and there's some of the barriers to building homes, just more homes, whether they're income restricted, capital A affordable or not. There are quite a few barriers, and excuse me, some of them are not in our control as a state. For instance, there's been a real increase, it's moderating now, in construction costs, material costs during the pandemic. Those costs soared. We as a state can't really influence that, as far as I know. But a major barrier, and it contributes to the cost of housing, is our regulatory environment. So unlike 40 years ago, I mean, my home was built in 1970, I think. Unlike then and before then, the towns had implemented much stricter rules around what housing they'll allow. So they require much larger pieces of land, which increases the cost of housing, particularly in really desirable towns where land is expensive. Some towns require that even things that really technically, or not technically, they're not legal anymore, but they require things like minimum square footage of the home. So they require lengthy approval processes, sometimes that take years, and there's no guarantee that the housing will be developed. All those things, they grow on each other and mean that it's very difficult to build lower cost housing. So, many towns in Connecticut have what people like to call starter homes. If you're in a community that has smaller homes, like when I grew up in a little 1,000-square-foot ranch, that's probably being generous. If it was 1,000, that home is like 60, 70 years old now, and we don't build those kind of homes anymore. And part of the reason we don't is if you need 2 acres to build on instead of like 1/8 of an acre, no builder could sell that home. The land is just too expensive to build a little house on. It's kind of perverse. And because of that, we just don't have enough new homes for folks that need something different than a big home on a 2-acre lot, let's say, right? So those regulatory barriers are a major problem in Connecticut. Connecticut really is, the general term folks use, I think, in policy is exclusionary zoning, often to kind of capture that whole regime of like making it harder to build homes. And Connecticut has been doing that for quite a long time. And compared nationally, we have much more excessive requirements than most of the states in the country. And that all contributes to making it harder to build any new homes.
Interesting. So what are policy solutions that could address some of the barriers that you've listed? I'm hearing requirements around lot size, around square footage.
Yeah.
What are some approaches that we've seen work other places, things that can reduce some of the barriers that you just mentioned?
Yeah, and the other one I didn't mention is just requirement that the only type of home that can be built is a single family detached home. Right, that's most of the land that's zoned for residential use in the state. I think it's over 80% of that that's all that's allowed. And if you want to do anything else, it requires a very lengthy process, and you're likely not to be able to do it. So that's one thing we see across the country are efforts to loosen that a little bit, to allow more of a mix of housing in neighborhoods, mixed housing types. So instead of just a single family home, maybe a duplex or a single family home with attached accessory apartment or in-law apartment or a 3-family home or small apartment buildings in parts of town where that makes sense. There's efforts, and Minneapolis has done that recently. California's in the news a lot for doing that. Massachusetts, particularly, is in the last couple of years has acquired towns now to zone to allow more housing near their transit stations, and those are so-called transit-oriented development. You might hear that term. Those are all efforts to try to make it easier to house more people, to provide homes for people of different types in their different stages of their life.
I'm really glad that you mentioned transit-oriented development. That is an issue that I know Partnership for Strong Communities and AARP Connecticut have both supported here in Connecticut during this legislative session. There's House Bill 6890 that advocates refer to as Work, Live, Ride. What would this legislation do?
So yes, the Work, Live, Ride bill is an effort to incentivize the construction and the permitting of denser housing, something other than single family homes near our mass transit, near our rail stations, whether it's Metro North or the Hartford line, but also near our regular bus services and CT Fast Track and track in the Hartford region. What it would do is it says if towns make a commitment to change their zoning to allow certain amount of more of homes within a reasonable distance of the transit stations, that would make them eligible for a lot of assistance from the state. And it would also prioritize their access to what are called discretionary infrastructure grants. So there's the state ministers many different programs with for grants for all kinds of things, from sewage treatment plant enhancements, sidewalk, pedestrian improvements. So these kind of infrastructure grants, if the ones that are discretionary, in other words, that the state can kind of prioritize how it spends it, that if you become one of these transit-oriented communities, you agree to make these types of changes, that would give you priority access to some of that. And it would also give you prior access to technical assistance and support from state staff to help with the planning and implementation of that. So we're ultimately with the goal of saying we need as a state to prioritize access to public transit and for all kinds of everybody, right? Not everyone should have to make every trip in a car. Some people, my mom's an example. I mentioned the home I grew up in. She still lives there, but it's even though it's in Waterbury, it's not close to any transit. She's forced to drive, even though she, doesn't really like doing that much anymore. We want to help people like my mom have choices where they can live somewhere where they can do certain things, basic things in their lives, like shopping and go to the post office or go visit a friend, like make it easy for them to do that on a bus or a train.
Now, this was one of the most contentious public hearings that I've sat through this legislative session around the Work, Live, Ride bill. What are some of the biggest misconceptions that you think are around this legislation? What do people, correctly understand or misunderstand about what this transit-oriented development bill would do?
Well, I think one thing is, folks, it's optional for communities, right? First of all, not every community has transit, so those communities, it really doesn't apply. So there's communities, mostly I would say out in the northeast corner of the state or Litchfield County, that this bill's provisions would not impact them positively or negatively. But so that's one thing. It's not universal. The other is that it's a voluntary thing. A community may choose not to do this, and what it means is they continue doing what they're doing now, but it means they do not have access to those state resources, technical assistance from the state, and the prioritization for discretionary grants. So, and I think that's been played up, I think, by opponents as the state taking money away from communities. And the way I understand it is, it's the state's policy goal should be that we can affordably house people that our residents, right, can find homes that they need in order to have fulfilling lives with their jobs and families. And that's a responsibility of the state. And to me, it only makes sense that the state would choose to spend its money in ways that support that. So I don't see that as a penalty for the other town.
Now, again, on this topic of affordable housing and transportation and the important intersection there, you recently authored a report called Affordable Housing Near Transit in Connecticut. What were some of the key findings and recommendations that came out of that report?
Sure. So I looked at the 40 or so municipalities that have either rail stations or a CT fast track station. Those are fixed stations rather than like bus routes, which don't necessarily have that infrastructure. So I limited it to those 40 towns and 2 other towns that are expected to get train stations soon. We hope. And what I found is there's those towns, there's diversity of Connecticut. You see that in the communities that have these rail stations. You go all the way, I think, from Reading to communities like Hartford and Bridgeport, very different places. And because of that, you see very different, you learn different things about the community. So many of our Fairfield County stations outside of Stamford and Danbury, Norwalk, the folks that live right next to the station are very wealthy relative to the rest of the state. The land use is less dense, right? So in other words, there's fewer homes near the stations. There's less diversity, folks, than you might see in the cities. So folks that live in the station are overwhelmingly white, where if you go to Bridgeport, that's not the case. Now, some of that all seems self-evident to people, perhaps if you know the state at all, but the question is why? Why are communities with, if we look particularly at Fairfield County along the 95 corridor, communities with incredible access to the global economy, really, with New York City, yet we have such a disparity and differences between access, right? And that's really in the end what happens when we have things like large lot requirements and only allowing single family homes and et cetera, is you're limiting access, right? And what I see in that study, what I've seen in that paper is that in particularly Fairfield County, we see that is pretty severe. You don't see that as you move up, say, the 91 corridor, right, the Hartford line. Those communities are a little different. There's a lot of kind of older industrial cities like Meriden and in Wallingford and New Britain. And there's been a lot of development near their train stations, particularly New Britain and Meriden. And it's really tremendous to see that, they're taking advantage of that access for their residents and for future residents. So it's not one story, you see, but it does demonstrate the disparity that we have in Connecticut that I think most of us already know, that city residents live very often than suburban residents.
So we have covered a lot of ground and need to wrap up the conversation. But for folks who are hearing this and feel really interested in the topic and want to learn more and perhaps get involved in advocating for some of these issues at either the community or the state level, what would you recommend for next steps for folks in terms of where to go to learn more, or who to reach out to if they feel strongly about changing some of this in Connecticut?
If we're talking about transit-oriented communities, I definitely recommend folks to go to Desegregate Connecticut's website. They have an incredible amount of studies and research. You can look at every one of these transit stations in detail. You could get lost in the amount of data there. The other place I'd point them to is the AARP, really leaders in nationally in talking about livable communities and how to make really complete communities. You'll hear that term too often. Places that are sustainable and people can live full lives, are not aren't, like I mentioned, aren't auto dependent. So I really recommend, I use AARP resources all the time around this. And the other is I would recommend going to our website, pschousing.org, particularly now because you can check out, among other things, our legislative agenda, where we're advocating for more resources to build affordable homes, but also to reform some of our land use regulations that we've been talking about.
Great. Well, we covered a lot of ground. I learned
Yeah.
a lot from our conversation. I hope other folks listening today did as well. Thank you so much, Sean Ghio from the Partnership for Strong Communities. We
Yeah.
really appreciate having you with us today. And we hope that everyone will join us again in another 2 weeks for another episode of Coffee and Tea with AARP. Have a great day.
Thanks, Anna.